I remember the sound before I remember the sight. A bell, not rung, but coughing into life, the old tower's throat clearing after years of silence. It was dusk in Oxford, and the rain had started again, a half-hearted drizzle that smudged the edges of the colleges and softened their stern lines. I had been standing beneath the cloisters of St. Simeon's, waiting for Lewis, though I could not have said why we were there at all. The summons had been vague, written in a hand that trembled between apology and defiance. The porter had found the letter on his desk that morning. To Inspector Morse it began, not Chief Inspector, not even detective, simply Inspector, as if from another age. No address, no signature, only the thin blue watermark of St. Simeon's College, and one curious phrase, "There are echoes where there should be none." When we arrived, the tower was locked. Lewis had gone to fetch the key from the porter's lodge, muttering something about my taste for melodrama. I had lingered by the chapel door, tracing with a fingertip the greenish lichen on the stone, its pattern reminding me of a half-solved crossword, letters fading where certainty had once been. Inside, the air smelled of dust and hymn books, candle wax, too, faint and old, the kind of smell that lingers longer than faith. Lewis returned, jangling the key. The door protested, a long sigh of hinges unused. We climbed the spiral stair without speaking, each step a note in a slow, ascending scale. Halfway up, I heard that curious sound again, like a voice swallowed by the walls. I stopped listening. Lewis looked back, his face half in shadow. "Did you hear that?" he asked, though the question sounded more like a confession. I said nothing. There are times when silence is a form of agreement. At the top, the bell chamber was empty. The great bronze mouth hung motionless, its clapper tied with a length of black cord. Beneath it, on the flagstones, lay a scatter of chalk dust and a single book, the college register. I picked it up, the spine cracked, pages swollen from damp. Near the end, a name had been crossed out in heavy ink, Harland, A.R. I knew the name faintly, as one knows the answer to a clue glimpsed too late. The wind had risen. It found the narrow slits of the tower and moaned through them, turning stone into throat. Lewis asked who Harland was. "A fellow once," I told him. "Mathematics. Vanished after the Hillary term some years ago. Suicide, they said. I remember reading it between cases. A note found, a body not." Lewis shivered. "It's colder up here," he said, as though the chill were recent. But I had noticed something else. The cord binding the clapper was new, nylon, not hemp, a small modern defiance inside an ancient ritual. Someone, I thought, had wanted this bell to stay silent, but not too long. I bent, brushing aside the chalk. Beneath it, faint grooves marked the stone initials, perhaps, or an attempt to write a sum that never added up. Lewis knelt beside me, the torch trembling slightly in his hand. The letters resolved themselves, slow as a memory, SDG Soli Deo Gloria. For the glory of God, a pious farewell or an apology. We left the tower just as the rain hardened into proper English. The porter met us at the door, his face pale as wet parchment. He asked if we had found anything. I told him only that the air up there needed clearing. He nodded, as though understanding a language no longer spoken. Back in the car, Lewis drove without a word. I watched the rain smear the windscreen, thinking how every echo begins as a voice. Somewhere in the mathematics of loss, a man had vanished, and someone years later had chosen to remind the world of that unfinished sum. That night, in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and sat by the window. The rain had not stopped. Beneath it, Oxford seemed to breathe in slow, damp rhythm, a city always on the verge of remembering. I thought again of the bell, the nylon cord, the erased name. A problem, perhaps, already half solved, or merely half heard. It was the following morning when I found myself back at St. Simeon's, though I hadn't planned to be. Habit, perhaps, or that quiet tug of unfinished business that passes for curiosity in my profession. The rain had stopped, but the city still shone with the residue of its pavements dark as ink, windows clouded like breath on glass. The porter nodded as I entered, as though he'd been expecting me all along. There was something in his eyes, a hesitation, almost relief, that I filed away without comment. The library stood at the heart of the college, a square room of quiet defiance, the sort of place where secrets age well. Dust motes floated through shafts of pale light, drifting like slow, unhurried thoughts. The air was thick with the faint perfume of vellum and neglect. Somewhere in the rafters, a clock ticked with academic precision. I told myself I was only there to browse the archives, but that's the kind of lie policemen tell themselves when the truth is too irrational. I was looking for Harland, or rather, the shadow he'd left behind. The mathematician who vanished without a trace and whose name had been erased with such furious ink that the page itself had bruised. Lewis was not with me. I'd sent him to speak to the porter's niece, who'd mentioned once, half in gossip, half in guilt, that Harland used to spend hours alone in the library even after his fellowship was withdrawn. They said he was still seen, late at night, writing letters no one ever received. The librarian, a narrow woman with a mouth like a ruled line, watched me as I wandered among the shelves. She said that scholars often left things behind marginalia, forgotten books, fragments of paper between the pages. I asked whether Harland had done so. She hesitated, then pointed toward the north alcove, where the older volumes were kept. The mathematics section. It seemed fitting. The table there was small, almost monastic. A single lamp, its brass stem dull with age, illuminated a copy of Principia Mathematica open halfway through, as though someone had just risen for tea and never returned. I sat, letting my fingers drift across the margins, and there, slipped between two pages, I found it. A letter, folded twice, edges softened by touch. The paper bore the faint watermark of the college that had the same pale blue script as before. It was addressed to no one, or perhaps to everyone. The handwriting was delicate, but uneven, as though the writer had been uncertain of the world's willingness to listen. I read only a fragment before the words began to blur. If truth can be divided infinitely, what remains of certainty? A mathematician's despair, or a confession disguised as a theorem? I noticed the ink was brownish, not black, the kind that fades faster than memory. As I slipped the letter into my coat pocket, something else caught my eye. A pattern in the dust on the table, circular smudges, evenly spaced. The outline of a glass, perhaps several. Wine, not water. Harland had not been alone with his thoughts after all. The librarian reappeared at the edge of the light. She asked if I had found what I was looking for. I told her no, though I suspect she heard the lie in my tone. As I turned to leave, she added that some nights she heard footsteps after the doors were locked. Someone walked slowly along the aisles as though counting the shelves. She'd stopped checking years ago, she said. Some silences aren't meant to be disturbed. Outside, the afternoon had grown restless. Students hurried past with umbrellas, their laughter echoing faintly off the stone. I stood under the archway and reread the line from Harland's letter, letting the question turn over in my mind. If truth could be divided infinitely, perhaps guilt could become smaller and smaller until no one could be blamed for it at all. In the car, I made a note in my book Harland Wine Late Nights, erased name, Echo. Then, without knowing why, I added a question mark beside the word library. It struck me that the bell tower and the library shared one thing in common. Both places were built to keep sound in, not out. And perhaps beneath all their stillness, both had begun to remember something they were supposed to forget. That night, I dreamed of the letter again. Not the words, but the ink, bleeding slowly into the paper, like a secret that refuses to stay written. There are certain sounds that never quite leave the mind: a note, a voice, the echo of a place long gone quiet. That evening I found myself drawn toward St. Aldhelm's, a small church hidden behind a row of elms on the southern edge of Oxford. I had passed it countless times before, never once imagining it would one day find its way into a case. But cases, like bells, have a way of calling you back when you least expect them. It was Lewis who suggested it, though not deliberately. He had mentioned over tea that Harland once attended the Bell Ringers Guild there, a circle of men and women who practiced their peculiar arithmetic of sound every Wednesday night. The idea of a mathematician drawn to the precision of ringing seemed too neat to ignore. The rain had started again, light and intermittent, the sort of rain that misted the lamps and blurred the outlines of certainty. When I arrived, the tower door was ajar, and the muffled rhythm of the bells was already in motion, slow, careful, like conversation between strangers. Inside, the air was warm, faintly metallic with the scent of old rope and candle soot. The ringers stood in a circle, each with a rope coiled in their hand, their faces lifted toward the unseen bells above. I watched them for a while before anyone noticed me. It was the woman in the red scarf who broke the spell. She asked if I was there to join, and I told her, half truthfully, that I was there to listen. The man leading them, Mr. Fallow, as he later introduced himself, had the calm precision of someone who had spent his life balancing on the edge of silence. He told me that Harland had rung the treble bell, the smallest one, and that he had not been particularly good at it. Too much thought, not enough instinct. Bells, he said, require surrender. There was something in the way he said it that lingered. Surrender. When the ringing ceased, I asked about the tower, whether Harland had ever stayed late. Fallow nodded. Often, he said. Sometimes, after practice, Harland would go up alone. He said he liked the acoustics that they helped him think of. The others had found it odd, but forgivable eccentricity, after all, was the unofficial language of Oxford. I asked if he had seemed troubled. Fallow hesitated. Not troubled exactly. More haunted by a question he couldn't phrase. He used to write things down between rings, numbers, symbols, sometimes words. I asked if any of those papers still existed. Fallow shrugged. He thought they had all been thrown out when the tower was cleaned last year. But the woman with the red scarf spoke then, her voice softer than the others. She remembered one scrap left behind. It had fallen between the floorboards near the bell wheel. She hadn't known what it meant, only that it was written in ink that had run, as if touched by rain. She thought it might still be there. We climbed the tower together, the steps spiraling upward through centuries of cold stone. Near the top, beneath the beam that held the bell frame, she knelt and pried loose a small wooden board. There, pressed flat by time, was the fragment, a torn corner of paper with a line scrawled across it, one sound for the living, one for the lost. I held it beneath the light of my torch. The handwriting was unmistakably the same looping uncertainty as in the letter from the library. But it was the second phrase that troubled me. One for the lost. A memory stirred the cord on the bell in St. Simeon's, tried to keep it silent. Perhaps it was not meant as silence at all, but restraint. A bell denied its proper note. On the walk back to the car, the bells began again, softer now, like the pulse of a sleeping city. I paused by the gate, watching the light flicker through the stained glass. I thought of Harland counting the patterns, finding comfort in their measured symmetry. I wondered what he heard in those chimes that no one else could. Lewis was waiting by the car, an expression that meant he'd found something, though he wasn't sure it mattered. The porter's niece had remembered another thing. Harland once asked for permission to ring the bells alone on the night before his disappearance. The same night, the tower was locked. As we drove away, the sound of the bells faded, though not entirely. Some echoes follow you home. There are moments in every investigation when the city itself seems to participate, as if Oxford, with all her spires and sighs, conspires to whisper some reluctant truth. That afternoon, the whisper came from the cloister of St. Simeon's. Lewis and I had returned to question the porter again, though I suspect he'd already told us all he knew. His manner was polite, but guarded, like a man trying to remember which secrets were his to keep. It was while Lewis busied himself with the register that my attention drifted toward the narrow passage running behind the chapel. The cloister there was half forgotten, a relic of some earlier century, the stone uneven, the air faint with damp and candle ash. Rainwater trickled along the grooves between slabs, carrying tiny reflections of the sky. It was there, beneath one of the arched windows, that I noticed the notice board. It held the usual detritus of academic life, memorial services, recitals, a missing umbrella, all fading into sameness. But one photograph, pinned slightly askew, caught my eye. It was small, perhaps 3 inches square, printed on the kind of paper used in college yearbooks. 6 men stood before the bell tower, their expressions caught somewhere between pride and fatigue. The Ringers' Guild, I assumed, but there was something uneasy about the symmetry. The composition was too deliberate, as if arranged by someone who distrusted chance. I took the photograph down and brushed away a film of dust. Harland stood at the centre, his features sharper than I'd expected. A gaunt man, bespectacled, his tie slightly askew. To his right stood Fallow, the guildmaster I'd met at St. Aldhelm's, his hand resting almost proprietorially on Harland's shoulder. The other 3 men and 1 woman were unfamiliar, but it was not the faces that drew me in. It was the background, the tower behind them. At first, it looked ordinary enough, but as I held the photograph closer to the window's light, I saw the faint outline of a figure at one of the upper windows, blurred, distant, yet unmistakably human. A smudge of darkness where there should have been light. Lewis rejoined me, asking what I'd found. I handed him the photograph without comment. He frowned, then squinted. "Someone's up there," he said quietly. "But this must have been taken years ago." "Years ago, yes, but the figure's posture was curious, not watching, not waving, merely waiting. The proportions were wrong for Harland himself, taller, broader." The porter, who had been hovering nearby, noticed the photograph in my hand and paled. He said it had been there since before his time. No one knew who pinned it. Sometimes it fell, he added, and he'd find it face down on the floor in the mornings. He'd grown used to putting it back. There was something in his tone that suggested he did so more from fear than respect. I asked if the photograph had ever been copied or catalogued. He shook his head. "College property?" he said, vaguely, though I could see he wanted it gone from his sight. I slipped it into my coat pocket. Lewis raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Back in my office that night, I studied it under the lamplight. The details deepened the expression on Harland's face, a faint half-smile not of pleasure, but resignation. The woman's eyes turned slightly away from the camera, the subtle shadow on the flagstone beneath their feet, as if the photograph had captured a sound rather than an image. I took out the letter from the library and placed it beside the photograph. If truth can be divided infinitely, I traced the ink with my finger. Perhaps Harland had not vanished because of despair or guilt. Perhaps he had followed something like a pattern, a sequence, a sound that had promised meaning and delivered only silence. But there was something else too. On the lower corner of the photograph, barely visible, a small handwritten mark, SDG, the same initials carved beneath the bell. I sat back, the whiskey in my hand untouched. It was beginning to feel less like a coincidence and more like a composition, a piece of music written for instruments not yet revealed. Outside, the rain began again, soft and patient. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bell tolled a single note, uncertain, as though testing its own echo. The confession came quietly, like most truths do. Not in a police station, nor under the hum of fluorescent lights, but in the small vestry of St. Aldhelm's, where the air smelled of old linen and the last traces of incense. It was late afternoon, and the winter light slanted through the stained glass in bruised colours. I remember the way it fell across her hands, folded neatly, as though in prayer before she spoke. Her name was Alice Fenton. 19, perhaps 20, though she had the kind of face that never quite settled on an age. She sang in the church choir and had done so since she was 12. She told me she'd known Harland, but not well. That was how she began. They always start with distance. It makes what follows easier to survive. Lewis stood by the door, pretending to examine the hymnals. He had the look of a man who wanted to be anywhere else. I told him to stay. Confessions, I've learned, have a way of changing shape once the listener leaves. Alice's voice was soft but clear. Harland used to come to the church late, she said, after practice. He'd sit in the back pew and listen while she locked up. Sometimes he'd ask her to sing, just one verse, anything she liked. At first, she thought harmless, lonely men often find solace in borrowed voices. But one evening, he'd asked her to sing a hymn she didn't know, not from the usual book. He'd brought his own sheet of music. No words, just notes. The pattern is strange, unfinished. She sang it once, only once. When she finished, she said he'd thanked her and then asked a question she hadn't understood. Could you hear the other part? She hadn't, of course, but he'd smiled almost sadly and said that was all right. Some people aren't meant to hear both sides. She looked up at me then, as though daring me to make sense of it. I asked if she still had the music. She nodded. It was in her choir book, she said, hidden between the psalms. I asked to see it. She hesitated, then rose and crossed to the cupboard. The paper she handed me was thin and slightly yellowed, like something that had been folded and unfolded too many times. The notes were irregular, looping in intervals that felt incomplete, the melody circling itself, never landing. Yet something about it tugged at the memory, not the sound, but the shape of it. Like handwriting one almost recognizes. I realized then that the sequence mirrored the letters in Harland's initials, translated into musical notation, A-R-H, a personal cipher. The man had been composing himself. Alice said she hadn't sung it again. That night she'd dreamt of bells not ringing, but humming, low and constant, as if from beneath the ground. A few days later she'd heard that Harland was missing. And once, not long after, she thought she saw him standing by the cloister window, just as the rain began. But when she blinked, he was gone. Lewis shifted uncomfortably. He didn't believe her, not entirely. I couldn't blame him. Yet there was something in her restraint that felt truer than certainty. She wasn't trying to believe, she was trying to unburden herself. I told her she'd done nothing wrong. That Harland had been a man tangled in his own logic. She asked if I thought he was dead. I told her that it depended on one's definition of the word. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belongs to those who have already rehearsed their grief. When she left, her footsteps echoed against the stone in a soft, uncertain rhythm. Lewis asked what I made of it all. I said that perhaps Harland had been searching for an echo not of sound, but of himself, something the bells could not provide, but a voice might. And maybe, in her song, he'd found the silence he'd been waiting for. That night, I played the melody on my piano. The notes faltered, incomplete, resolving into nothing. Yet in the space between them, I could almost hear another pattern, a counterpoint just beyond reach. By the time we reached the station, the rain had thickened into something almost deliberate, not a shower, but a siege. Oxford disappears under that kind of rain. The spires fade, the streets glisten like dark glass, and every sound seems half drowned before it reaches the ear. Lewis parked outside, his collar turned up, waiting for the inevitable. I told him we were close. I said it more to myself than to him. We'd spent the afternoon chasing what looked, for a few hours at least, like an ending. A name had emerged from a former colleague of Harland's, one Dr. Phipps. He'd left St. Simeon's under uncertain circumstances years earlier, and now lived above a bookshop near the High, a neat man, faintly theatrical, with a fondness for Latin tags and self-pity. He claimed Harland had visited him on the night he disappeared, claimed they had argued, claimed finally that Harland had spoken of leaving Oxford for good. Lewis had believed him, or nearly. Phipps's story was clean, arranged in perfect order, without the hesitations of guilt, but there was something too rehearsed about it, as if he'd been expecting the question. I've always distrusted those who answer too quickly. Truth, in my experience, is a slower animal. Phipps told us he and Harland had quarrelled over a paper about some abstruse theory about harmonic frequencies and their mathematical purity. He said Harland had become obsessed, even delusional, that he'd begun hearing patterns where none existed. I asked whether Phipps had seen him leave. He had not. He said he'd heard the door close and assumed that was the end of it, but I'd noticed his hands as he spoke, thin, ink-stained fingers, worrying a small burn on the inside of his wrist. Fresh, the kind made by a rope or a friction cord. When we left his rooms, Lewis looked at me with that patient exasperation of his and asked what I thought. I told him I thought the story fit too well. That truth rarely does. By evening the rain had followed us back to the college. The cloisters shone under the lamps, and the tower loomed like a thought half-remembered. The porter had left the key for us again, though this time his expression was almost pleading, as though he hoped we'd find nothing, so that the building could resume its silence. We climbed to the bell chamber. The air was close, metallic. The nylon cord still tied around the clapper gleamed faintly in the torchlight. I pulled at it gently, taut and secure. Beneath the beam the flagstones were darker than before, damp in a way the rain alone could not explain. Lewis knelt, pressing his fingers to the floor. "Not blood," he said, "just oil." He was right. But I knew then that someone had been there recently, adjusting something, or perhaps listening. I thought of Harland's unfinished melody, of the photograph in the cloister, of the faint figure behind the window. It was all beginning to form a pattern, not of crime, but of intention. A message written in echoes, and yet I couldn't read it. Not yet. Back outside, the bells of St. Aldhelm's began to ring in the distance. Their notes reached us through the rain, slow and mournful. Lewis said quietly that perhaps Harland had jumped after all, that all this searching was just our refusal to accept simplicity. He might have been right, but something in the sound of those bells unsettled me. They were ringing in the wrong sequence. The order was reversed. I asked Lewis if he heard it. He said they sounded the same as always. But I knew what I'd heard was a change so small it would mean nothing to most ears. A pattern inverted, a voice turned inside out. Harlan's final experiment, perhaps, still playing itself out across the city. We drove back through the rain without speaking. In the mirror, the tower receded into shadow, its windows faintly lit. I wondered if Phipps was watching from his rooms, or if Harland, wherever he had gone, had finally found his silence. At home, I poured a whiskey and sat by the window. The rain tapped the glass like a metronome, keeping time with something older than reason. I took out the letter, the photograph, the fragment of music, and laid them side by side. For a moment they almost made sense. The melody in the notes, the initials beneath the bell, the dark figure in the window, all pointing toward a single answer. But then the pattern shifted again, and the meaning dissolved. Perhaps it was never meant to resolve. Perhaps that was the point. There are certain men who make one feel complicit merely by standing in their presence. The Dean of St. Simeon's was one of them. His name was Elwood, a quiet, ascetic figure whose words fell like chalk dust, faint, dry, and hard to sweep away. I had requested to see him in connection with Harland, though in truth I wanted to measure the silence he kept around the man. He received us in his study in a narrow room lined with theological commentaries and the faint perfume of pipe smoke. Outside, the rain had not stopped but had lessened into that fine, indefinite drizzle that makes Oxford look like it is forever dissolving. He did not offer tea, nor apology for the hour. His tone was courteous but unyielding. I told him of the letters, the bells, and the photograph. He listened, or seemed to. His hands, pale against the dark wood of the desk, remained still. When I mentioned Harland's disappearance, he only sighed, as if we were discussing the weather. It was not the indifference of ignorance, but of guilt too old to be remedied. He said Harland had been troubled, yes, but brilliant, that he'd come to the college with theories too obscure to be understood by his peers, theories about mathematics and music, about frequencies that could mimic human emotion. Elwood had advised him to take leave. He had not expected him to vanish. As he spoke, I noticed a small detail, the faint indentation on the right side of his desk where a book had rested for many years. The shelf above it was empty, dust undisturbed except for one narrow line, as though something had been recently removed. I asked, what used to be there? His gaze faltered just once. He said he didn't recall. It was a poor lie. Lewis, ever more forthright, asked whether the Dean believed Harland dead. Elwood replied that some minds are not built for this world, that brilliance, untethered, becomes its own undoing. His phrasing struck me as the kind of polished fatalism that hides more than it reveals. When we left, Lewis muttered that the man was hiding something. I told him that of course he was. Men in authority always are. The question is whether what they hide is sin or sorrow. We had nearly reached the gate when I heard the bell. Not from the tower this time, but from within the chapel itself, a faint, metallic chime, as if something small had been struck by accident. I turned back. The Dean was standing in the doorway watching us leave. For a moment, the figure seemed almost spectral against the candlelight. That night, I could not sleep. The rain persisted, more a texture than a sound. I found myself thinking again of his office, of the missing book, of the mark left behind. Dust remembers what people forget. At dawn, I returned alone. The porter, half asleep, let me in without protest. The Dean's study door was ajar. The smell of pipe smoke lingered faintly, but the fire was cold. On the desk lay a single envelope addressed in Harland's hand. No seal, only a thin thread of wax where one might have been. Inside, a letter brief, formal, yet trembling with the effort of restraint. To the Dean, the pattern resolves tonight. I have heard the last note, no signature, no date. I looked toward the shelf again. The missing book had been replaced. Its spine read, Harmonia Mundi, the mathematics of sacred sound. The irony did not escape me. Lewis arrived shortly after, breath misting in the morning chill. He asked if I'd found anything. I told him only that Harland had left a message. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't meant for the Dean. It was meant for anyone still listening. Before we left, I noticed something faint on the lower corner of the letter, a watermark. The same as before the pale blue crest of St. Simeon's, circled by the Latin motto Veritas insonitu. Truth in sound. And for the first time I wondered whether Harland had been trying to find the truth, or to bury it beneath the noise. I have always distrusted keys. They promise access, but rarely to the things one truly wants to unlock. That morning, Lewis arrived with one brass, narrow and worn from use, sealed in an envelope. The porter had found it on the chapel steps, half buried in the moss as though it had been waiting to be discovered. It was, he told me, the key to the bell tower, the original, not the copy we'd been using. I turned it over in my hand, its ridges worn smooth by time. Whoever had used it last had done so often and recently. Lewis said he thought it proved someone had been returning to the tower long after Harland disappeared. I told him perhaps, though evidence, like faith, depends on interpretation. Still there was something about the key that unsettled me, not what it opened, but what it implied. We walked back to St. Simeon's together, the morning mist clinging to the roofs. The streets were still wet from the night's rain, glistening like the surface of a thought one can't quite grasp. The porter met us at the gate, eyes flicking nervously toward the tower. He said the bells had rung again in the small hours, not a peal, just 2 notes, uneven, hesitant. I asked if anyone else had heard. He hesitated before saying yes to the Dean. In the daylight, the tower seemed smaller than I remembered, less a monument, more a question. We climbed slowly, our footsteps echoing in counterpoint. The door at the top yielded easily to the new key. Inside, everything was as before, the bell motionless, the nylon cord still looped tight around its clapper. But there was something new. On the ledge near the window, half concealed beneath a layer of dust, lay a small metal tuning fork. When I struck it gently against the stone, the tone rang clear, almost pure, a single note suspended in the thick air. And then faintly I heard it. A second vibration, a reply, low and distant, rising from somewhere below. Lewis didn't hear it. He looked at me with that mixture of patience and pity he reserved for my less tangible observations. I told him the sound wasn't from the fork itself, but from the resonance it had awakened. Something else in the tower, perhaps a pipe, a wire, or something human had answered. I searched the chamber more carefully. Near the base of the bell frame, hidden by the shadows, was a small wooden box, its latch rusted but intact. Inside, folded neatly, lay a single page of sheet music, the same strange sequence Alice Fenton had sung, only now complete. The missing bars filled in with precision. Beneath it, a note in Harland's hand. 2 tones, 1 truth. Lewis asked what it meant. I said I didn't know, though even as I spoke, I did. The clue was not in the notes, but in their intervals, the distance between sound and silence. Harland had written not a melody, but a map. Back at the college, I sat in the cloister and studied the paper again. The pattern, when inverted, matched the sequence of numbers carved into the bell's inner rim, something I'd noticed earlier, but dismissed as maintenance marks. It formed a date, March 12th, the day before Harland vanished. I walked to the Dean's study without sending word ahead. He was at his desk, a cup of tea untouched beside him. When I placed the sheet before him, he barely glanced at it. He said only that the matter was now theological, not criminal. I asked if he'd heard the bells last night. He nodded almost serenely. Then he said that some sounds are meant for those who've earned them. I left without another word. That evening I returned to the tower alone. The mist had thickened into fog, wrapping the college in soft uncertainty. The key turned smoothly as though welcoming me back. Inside I struck the tuning fork once more. The note rose, lingered, and was answered. But this time I traced its echo downward to the floor beneath the bell frame. There, between the flagstones, was a narrow seam, recently disturbed. I did not lift it. Some discoveries are less about revelation than restraint. I stood for a while, listening to the silence that followed the fading note. The key was still warm in my palm. When I left it on the ledge, it made a sound like the beginning of another question. It was the sound that woke me, not the city's ordinary music, not the rain against the glass, nor the low hum of the street lamps outside my window, but something rarer, more deliberate. A bell, one, then another. I lay still, half caught between sleep and recollection, counting the silence between the notes. 2 rings uneven in tone, the second lower, as though spoken from the throat of something buried too deep. I rose, dressed and left before dawn, the city still breathing in its first grey hour. When I reached St. Simeon's, the mist had settled thickly over the courtyard. It was the kind of mist that turns the familiar into rumour arches becoming ghosts, cobblestones dissolving into nothing. The porter's light glowed faintly in the lodge, and he started when he saw me. He said the bells had rung again just before 5. No one inside, no one at all. Lewis arrived minutes later, his hair wet, his expression the measured patience of a man long accustomed to my early calls. He asked if I thought someone had broken in again. I said perhaps, though I already knew the truth was less practical than that. Bells do not always need hands. We climbed the tower together, the key cold in my palm. Inside, the air felt different, heavier somehow, as though holding its breath. The clapper is still bound tight with nylon, untouched. Yet the dust on the floor had shifted. 2 sets of footprints, not recent, but clear. One large, one small. Both leading toward the corner where the flagstones had been disturbed. Lewis knelt to inspect them, tracing the edge of the loosened stone. He said it looked as though someone had tried to lift it recently. I told him not to. The air beneath was faintly hollow, the sound of secrecy preserved. He asked what I was waiting for. I said the second bell. There was a pause long enough for him to sigh, long enough for me to regret saying it aloud. Then faintly, from the chapel below, came the echo. A second bell again, not the great bronze above us, but something smaller, a handbell perhaps, or something that wanted to be mistaken for one. We descended in silence. The chapel door was ajar, a sliver of candlelight flickering through. Inside, the dean was kneeling by the altar. He rose when we entered, his face pale, his movements deliberate. He said he'd been praying for the soul of Harland, as he often did. But his hands betrayed him trembling, flecked with grey dust. Lewis asked if he'd been in the tower. The dean denied it gently, almost kindly, as one might correct a child's misunderstanding. He said the bells had always rung in pairs, that it was part of the tradition, forgotten by most. One for the living, one for the lost. I asked when the last time he'd heard both had been. He hesitated, eyes drifting toward the far window where dawn was beginning to gather. He said not since Harland's last night. When he left us, the chapel seemed emptier for his absence. I walked to the lectern where the service book lay open. Between the pages, someone had pressed a thin strip of paper, a scrap torn from sheet music. The same strange notations again, but with an addition this time, 2 final notes, written one above the other, harmony if played together, dissonance if rung apart. Lewis looked over my shoulder. He said it proved Harland had finished his composition after all. I told him it proved nothing, or perhaps it proved everything. We stepped outside into the cold. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the tower's shape against the whitening sky. I turned back once, listening. For a moment, I thought I heard it again, a low hum beneath the stillness, like the memory of sound. Lewis asked if I was satisfied now. I said satisfaction was for simpler men. That night, I sat alone in my flat, the window open to the rain. I poured a whiskey and watched the city blur into darkness. I found myself humming the sequence from Harland's music, the impossible melody, the one Alice had sung, the one the bells had echoed. When I reached the end, I struck my glass lightly against the table. The sound it made was not pure, not whole, but it lingered long enough for me to hear its twin reply somewhere deep within the night. I remember the sound not as an event, but as a hesitation. It was too late for the ceremony, too early for grief. The bell at St. Simeon's rang once more, a single note folding into the night, and for a moment I thought it might stop there, content in its own solitude. But then it came again, slightly off, as though unsure of itself, the bell that rang too late. By then the investigation had long ceased to resemble one. There were no statements left to take, no witnesses who hadn't already given their silences. What remained was the echo of the faint tremor of something that had never entirely been solved nor wanted to be. Lewis and I had returned that evening to close the file, though neither of us said as much. The college was still, the kind of stillness that feels curated. A final evensong had ended an hour earlier, and the smell of candle wax still lingered in the aisles. Outside the rain had stopped, but left its residue on every surface of the city breathing steam. We spoke to no one. The porter, who once flinched at my questions, now met them with weary compliance. He handed over the tower key without a word. I noticed his hands were trembling. He said it was just the cold. It wasn't. We climbed again. I could have walked those stairs blindfolded by then, each turn memorized, each step carrying the faint weight of repetition. At the top, the air was colder than before, thinner. The bell hung perfectly still, yet the vibration of that late chime still lingered in the iron, a memory refusing to dissipate. Lewis checked the mechanism, the clapper, the ropes, all secure. He muttered that it made no sense, that perhaps wind or weight had caused it. I told him the wind doesn't tune itself. He said nothing after that. I circled the chamber slowly, tracing the edges of the flagstones where the floor dipped imperceptibly. I paused by the seam, the one we'd found weeks before. Someone had disturbed it again. The dust was unsettled, the faint outline of a shoe pressed into the grime. Not recent, perhaps, but not old enough to ignore. I asked Lewis to fetch the crowbar from the landing below. He hesitated, perhaps sensing what I already suspected. When he returned, we lifted the stone carefully. Beneath it, darkness, and within that darkness, something that caught the light. A small brass object. It was a handbell, tarnished but unmistakable. The second bell. It was lighter than I expected. Delicate, not for summoning, but for remembering. Inside, the clapper had been replaced with a fragment of wire wound tightly around a small note of paper. I unwrapped it. The handwriting was Harland's, the same hesitant slope, the same obsessive precision. Only one line. It was never about the sound. Lewis looked at me, waiting for translation. I didn't offer one. There are moments when explanation feels like desecration. We replaced the stone. The tower seemed different after that, quieter, though nothing had changed. Lewis asked what we'd tell the Dean. I said we'd tell him what he already knew, that Harland's search had ended where it began, in the space between sound and silence. On the way down, I paused by the narrow window overlooking the cloister. The mist was lifting, and the lamps below had begun to flicker. In the faint glow, I could see the old photograph still pinned to the notice board, 6 ringers, and the shadow in the tower window unchanged. But now I saw what I had missed before: the angle of the shadow. It was not cast from within the tower at all. It fell upon it. Later, back in my flat, I poured a drink and sat by the window. The rain began again, softly, as if reconsidering its earlier retreat. I held the handbell, turning it in the lamplight. When I shook it gently, it made no sound, yet something in the air shifted as though listening. Lewis had once said that Harland was chasing music no one could hear. I think now he was wrong. I think Harland heard it perfectly, only too late. Outside, far away, another bell began to ring. Not from St. Simeon's this time, but from somewhere else, faint, indistinct, perhaps imaginary. 2 notes once more, one for the living, one for the lost.